soon as we possibly can. And so without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Penny to the Food Focus stage. Thank you so much, Penny, for making yourself available. We really are very appreciative of the fact that the Director General has allowed you to participate in this process and that you've made yourself available to do so. I think you can see from the level of registrations that people are very interested in what you have to say today, and so we're looking forward to that. Penny, maybe you can just give us your official title and where you fit in the Department of Health.
Okay, good morning all. I'm from the Directorate Food Control at the National Department of Health, and that fits into a cluster called Nutrition, Health Promotion, Oral Health and Food Control. We've recently been moved to that cluster, and I think it's actually been a good move because then we speak to all issues, health promotion, oral health, as well as nutrition, which is really 2/3 of the work that we do in relation to labeling and in relation to regulatory nutrition. So I'm honored to be here this morning. It's probably not the 4th industrial revolution technology, but for me it is. So I'm very honored to be part of this. Thank you very much, Linda.
That's a pleasure, Penny. Right, over to you. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Linda, in my line of work, I do a lot of regulatory work, and so often definitions are critical or important to how you actually interpret many of the things that we deal with. And so therefore, I'm going to start with giving you a definition of what food control is. And this is a definition that comes from the World Health Organization. And what they basically say is that it's a mandatory regulatory activity, which means there must be some other law in place to ensure consumer protection. And that law can either be at national level or at local authority level, but the aim of it all is to ensure that consumers are protected and to ensure that all foods during the entire food system, production, handling, storage, processing, and distribution are safe, wholesome, as well as fit for human consumption, as well as conform to quality and safety requirements. And then the last one are honestly and accurately labeled by law. So this is to ensure that, you know, everything goes into this food basket of food control. So when we look at the definition, it basically, in summary, it covers food safety, which I think is what the main aim of today's discussion is. It then looks at food quality and composition. It also looks at food labeling, as well as regulatory nutrition. So what are the things that we need to regulate from a nutrition point of view? And obviously, sometimes people will say we are over-regulating and we're wanting to become the great-grandfather of people. So that's the summary of food control. The next slide, the process that we work in South Africa is what we call a fragmented food control system, and I'm sure many people have seen this slide already, but basically we have 3 departments that look after food control in the country. The Department of Agriculture, which is now at national level changed. Fisheries and Forestries have moved to the Department of Environmental Affairs, which means we now have 4 pillars involved in food control, because aquaculture falls under the fishery component. But basically, the Department of Agriculture looks at quality aspects as well as the export of regulated agricultural products. They also look at agricultural inputs, which is your pesticides, fertilizers, and stock remedies. And they also are responsible for meat hygiene or meat safety, both from an import as well as an export point of view. And in the main, it's fresh meat. But when it comes to processed meat, they do have a role to play as well in terms of ensuring that it's fit for human consumption. The DTI has a number of entities that look after certain aspects. The NRCS, the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, looks a lot at frozen fish products and seafood, as well as canned meat that has a greater than 10% meat proportion. They will look at all aspects, import, export, as well as certification of those consignments. The Bureau of Standards, whenever a standard has been developed, it's always to be noted that it's a voluntary standard until such time that a piece of legislation has actually referenced that standard. Then you have SAMAS, who deals with a lot of the certification body accreditation, as well as accreditation of laboratories and inspectors. And the new player on the block in terms of that is the National Consumer Commission that looks after the Consumer Protection Act. Department of Health, we do import, manufacture, sale in the main processed food products, as well as food safety regulations and labeling. We are also the Codex contact point, and I'll have another slide at the end about Codex, but we are also the emergency contact points for various food safety networks to ensure that we can deal with food safety emergencies. The enforcement of these different departments works in different approaches. The agriculture component looks at issues from the national, provincial, as well as the Chinese. So, the Department of Health does imported foods via a national system, and then the enforcement of local and manufactured products, as well as the sale of products, is by the municipalities in health. And in the NRCS, they have a component of inspectors. The Consumer Protection Act I've put as the foundation of the entire food control system, because the Act is broad enough to not only look at the issues around goods that are unsafe for consumers, but they also have far-reaching powers to look into these three departments in terms of whether they actually deliver on their mandates and can be investigated in relation to what could have gone wrong with certain issues. The next definition that I'd like to share with you is the definition of food safety. And it's always important to have a look at this definition as well. It's from the World Health Organization. And it indicates that it's the assurance that food will not cause harm to the consumer when it is prepared and or eaten according to its intended use. So if you look at that, that is specifically looking at the end result of food. So it's actually at consumer level. And that's why food safety sits in the remit of the Department of Health, because it's a health outcome. If you look at that picture, it's about somebody getting sick. Obviously, that's not the only implications for food safety. There are other chronic things that can be the result of something that is unsafe. So it's not always the acute phase, which is probably what you see in that picture now. But that is what the definition of food safety. And when people say food safety from farm to fork, it's actually a misnomer. The actual issue that you're looking at from farm to fork is what we could call food hygiene. And that's the next slide. Press it again. Food hygiene this is the definition that we've added to the new 638. It's all the conditions and measures necessary to ensure the safety and suitability of food at all stages of the food chain. So this is where you get the issues of from farm to fork or from seed to plate, or whatever the terminology that came about quite a few years ago, where people, or even some countries, have even said food safety from farm to fork. And it's like saying HACCP brushes and HACCP tables and HACCP cleaning equipment. It's similar in relation to food safety and food hygiene. This is also just another slide to show that food safety is not just a government responsibility. It's not just an industry responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility for us all. And we get our leadership and our international consensus in relation to food safety mainly from the WHO, the World Health Organization, as well as the Food and Agricultural Organization. And then, of course, as governments, we have to have a national commitment to food safety. And the fact that we have a piece of legislation in place means that South Africa is committed to food safety in the country. But the three stakeholders of critical importance over and above government is the industry, because they are the ones responsible to prepare the safe food, and then the consumers who should know about how to actually prepare, because they are at the cold face of making sure that it does not cause harm to them as well. So it's a shared responsibility amongst us all. Our role as the Directorate Food Control, we have a statutory function to forbid the sale of foodstuffs, and this is in terms of the Foodstuffs Act. It must not be detrimental or cause harm to consumers, so that's the food safety component. We are also responsible to provide consumers with information to make informed and healthy choices in relation to food labeling. So it's not about the right to know, but about information about their health and how they should choose foods. To protect consumers from exploitation by false and misleading claims, and we're actually dealing with issues relating to that now that CBD has a bit of a relaxed situation from the medicine side. And then we also regulate certain aspects of nutrition, such as negative and positive nutrients, and to ensure that foods for medical purposes have the right quality and safety aspects as well, and that's what we call our regulatory nutrition component. So the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, who implements that is the industry, whether it's a manufacturer, whether it's an importer, whether it's an exporter, or whether it's a seller. And seller is also defined in terms of what sale means. It's not just the exchange in the normal retail sector, but it covers even a donation. So that is also covered in terms of what we talk about a seller there. And basically the industry must comply. That's the first step in terms of the legislation. Many people say you don't enforce, but the actual requirement of any law is compliance. So it's a very reactive piece of legislation, and it's not proactive like a Medicines Act, where you must first have the product registered before you place it on the market. The industry can put anything on the market, but they must ensure that it's safe. Then in terms of enforcement, I've already mentioned Port Health is now at national, and they're responsible to control imported foodstuffs at port of entry. And then 52 metro and district municipalities must be authorized by the minister to monitor and enforce the legislation. So they will check manufacturing facilities, they will check the sale, even imported products that are already on the shelf, as well as export. Because once it's on the shelf, it's in retail, and so therefore it's no longer regarded as an imported product. As I said, the philosophy of the Act is reactive. It places the onus on the manufacturer or the seller or the importer to comply. In particular, I must mention Section 2, that relates specifically to safety and places the onus on the manufacturer, seller, importer or exporter to ensure that a foodstuff is safe, irrespective of whether a regulation is in place in the legislation. So our Act is not like other pieces of legislation that requires a standard or a piece of legislation before you can prescribe the requirements. The onus actually rests on the manufacturer, the industry. Let me call them the industry for the sake of saying it quickly, that they then must be able to put something on the market that is safe, irrespective of whether we've specified a level or anything in relation to that kind of product. The law enforcer then goes into the situation to establish whether the foodstuff will then comply with the legislation. So he reacts to a particular situation. He might not catch everybody doing the wrong thing, but at the point in time that he catches somebody, he catches somebody. Then in terms of the prohibitive situation, we also have requirements that say trademarks mustn't mislead or deceive consumers, and then you mustn't also falsely describe the nature, the origin, or the contents of a product. And I've got a nice picture there that says we don't throw the baby out of the basket in terms of that false description as well, because if you actually had to think about it, if you looked at mincemeat, it's actually shredded cow flesh. So sometimes we could we mustn't cloud the situation when it comes to labeling as well. The other philosophies is that it's prescriptive and restrictive. So we can set legislation in terms of what the format or the appearance of a label must look like. It also provides for exemptions, and it also allows for the unavoidable presence of a foreign substance. So even if you had something that is there, but it could possibly cannot be prevented from being there. So for example, an allergen, that then we allow for in the actual Act. Then there are also standards for composition, strength, purity, and quality. So we could regulate that. But what we've said is, in the main, we want to look at food safety in the Foodstuffs Act. And there's another piece of legislation that came on long after the Foodstuffs Act, which is 1990, the Agricultural Product Standards Act. And we're working together with that component in agriculture to try and streamline any of the regulations that we had around composition or quality. And we've moved that old 1930 set of regulations over to that department. So they're in the process of rolling out those regulations. The only one we've kept for now is the Boerewors regulations, because we've had advice that, look, that was a piece of legislation to deal with the problem as it came up at that point in time. So let's keep it in place until such time that agriculture takes over that piece of legislation. Then, of course, we have standards for foodstuffs, premises, and then also for persons. So Minister has those powers to make regulations relating to that. The status of the food supply chain relating to foodstuffs legislation. This is just a schema to look at how how food moves from agriculture down to the consumer, and there's various processes. I'm not going to go too much into that because we don't have much time, but to just say that the Foodstuffs Act covers in the main from where primary food processing takes place, and all the other components are in the main looked after by good agricultural practices and or the Department of Agriculture. The only difference is the veterinary drugs, which are used at primary production level, but we will set the levels of how much should be left in a foodstuff or food commodity. The final thing is consumers. We can't regulate consumers, so we look at information and education through the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. So the meat of what you asked me to come and talk about, which is the regulations governing general hygiene requirements for food premises and the transport of foods, which is the 638 of the 22nd of June 2018. It replaces the R962 of 2012, as well as the old R918 of 1999. Now, in an hour, I can't give you a whole overview of the Act, so I'm only going to go through, of the regulation, sorry. So I'm only going to go through the things that we've dealt with and how we've dealt with them. So the first aspect is that we had the original 918 in 1999, and in 2003, when the new Health Act came into place, Section 54 of the 1977 Health Act still kept or retained the validity of the Act, and so therefore 918 was still valid. In 2012, the department repealed the 1977 Health Act entirely, and so with effect from the 1st of March 2012, we had no mandate for 918 to actually stand. So all the other regulations as well under 1977 Health Act ceased to be valid and could not be applied. We then put in place the Foodstuffs Bill in 2003, whereby we had brought in the provisions from the Health Act that looked at food safety and food premises, and we put them into the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, and we proclaimed that Act in 2009. So that amendment allowed us to then publish regulations relating to premises in the Act. And we had also looked at the other issues that were outdated or that were unconstitutional, so that we ensured that although the Act was published in 1972, it has undergone the constitutional review to ensure that it's still updated and in line with the new provisions of the country. In 2012, we quickly then published 962, purely because we did not have the microbiologist in place to actually do a technical review of 918, and we only changed issues relating to the constitutional arrangement. So, for example, in 918, a province and a local authority could issue a COA, but in 962 that could not happen because the Health Act had said the mandate for food control enforcement is municipalities, whether they be or whether whether they are A category or whether they're C category. So on that basis, we only published the 962 to update it. But the inspectors could still investigate the premises because they have powers under the Foodstuffs Act to inspect anything in relation to food premises, as well as any documentation on the food premises. So they could still continue enforcing hygiene standards, they just couldn't issue a COA. But at least we were able to then publish it in 2012. So that's the rationale that we had it then. So we did the minor editorial changes on that, and we aim to review it from a technical point of view at a later stage, and that work commenced in 2014. It actually commenced much earlier than that because the old director for food control, Mr. Dries Pretorius, had been intimately involved with the original 918, and so we first worked with him to look at the draft, and his main thing to me was, because I wanted to rewrite that entire regulation, was, Penny, don't fiddle too much with it because you'll confuse the EHPs. So that's why some of the things still remain or stay the way that they were originally drafted. So we started that work in February 2014. Of course, we didn't do it in isolation. We established an electronic working group of the various stakeholders, government, industry, as well as the EHPs, so that we could look at ensuring that we had broad participation in looking at what were the gaps, what were the challenges, as well as what was difficult to implement or understand in relation to the regulations. So there are terms of reference, and my hope with that was to ensure that we reduce the amount of comments once the draft was published. But lo and behold, that was not the case. So in 2015, we published the 364 of the 30th of April 2015. And after we had published the draft regulations and reviewed the comments, we then had discussions with those parties where we wanted to say, let's understand what you meant, because some of the comments were not very clear. So those were the other regulators, DAF, especially the Veterinary Public Health Unit, the NRCS, as well as industry on a lot of some of the issues, as well as our component at the national health level, which is environmental health, which is the section that is there to ensure or oversee implementation at the local level and at Port Health. What has changed in the regulations? Firstly, the science. Because we were published in 1999, I don't know if it had been looked at from a codex lens, but obviously if you look at some of the things, it wasn't. Because as South Africa, we were not part of the codex family, and we only became part of the codex family in 2004. So we ensured that we tried to align it with codex as well as the World Health Organizations, because we had in 2008 or so adopted the 5 keys to safer foods. We were actually one of the pilot countries to actually test the training modules. And when you look at the 5 keys and what is in R962 or R918, whichever one you want to use, they didn't correlate. So we had to make sure that they correlated. You couldn't have an IEC communication differing from a regulation. We also looked at other updates in terms of inclusion or deletion or modification of definitions. So we've added, we've deleted, and we've modified definitions. We've also deleted some sections as well because they were no longer relevant, or we've moved certain regulations to enhance clarity. So for example, 14 and 15 were both about exemptions, but in different contexts, and we just put them all into one umbrella and made it one regulation about exemptions. Also, there were certain things that were not clear in terms of the transport of food. When somebody already had a COA and had vehicles that needed to transport food, and I remember yourself as well asking about that. And then we brought in things that had come up as issues. There were butchery equipment that was an expose for Mr. Pretorius. I think it was in carte blanche or one of those things. We also brought in milk tank hygiene, because that's where a lot of challenges were coming up. And then we also brought in requirements for appliances. So for example, pasteurization we brought out of the milking sheds regulation, because that's a processing step already. So we've put it now into the R638 here. Then we cover all food premises except those controlled in terms of the Meat Safety Act. So wherever food is prepared, packaged, stored, distributed, it is covered, even if the NRCS regulates that industry. So if you look at the fishing industry where they regulate now, they're still required to have a certificate of acceptability, and then the NRCS builds on that in relation to what their requirements are in a voluntary, not a voluntary, sorry, a compulsory specification. Because they call it a VC, I always think voluntary. And then our food premises has always been that way, but we always want to emphasize it, that it's not just your normal 4 walls and four walls and floor and roof, but it can be any structure. It's any vehicle, it can be a stall, it can be the street food vendors situation outside, and it covers premises as big as your multinationals that have wonderful systems in place. The certificate of acceptability is to be issued by the local authority, and we've said in the regulation that all certificates of acceptability must be renewed by the 22nd of June this year, which means everybody should now have a COA in terms of 638. And the reason we've done that is in the interim we said 918 and 962 certificates are still valid up until this date, purely because we want to ensure that everybody starts on the clean slate with 638, because 918 would have been issued by a province or a local authority that was a category B municipality. So they would be unconstitutional if they continue. So we wanted to bring everybody on board, and because we've had new requirements added, for example, the training requirements, we've said we've got to now get everybody on the same level playing field, and so everybody's certificate should have been renewed in June. We've also added the requirements for transport of meat, and this is after the abattoir. And it's not that this is new requirements, this is a piece of legislation that has been in place since 1977. And obviously my aim is to try and put everything relating to one aspect into one piece of legislation instead of having separate pieces of legislation. So that has also been brought in. The certificate of acceptability, the new requirement is that it must have 2 signatures. In the past, it was just the 1 signature. We've now said to ensure that there's no fraud, that we also have the local authority designated person also co-signing after the inspector, just so that there's no, so that there's better control of over the certificates of acceptability. The issues have fairly remained the same in terms of the local authority can prohibit the handling and transportation of food. So when they visit your premises and they find that there's something wrong, they can prohibit or they can stop, depending on what the situation or what the hazard is at that point in time. They can also issue exemptions, and this is where it comes in relation to if you look at Regulation 5 and 6, it speaks in the main about what the premises must look like, what the light situation must be. But when you look at a street food vendor, they don't have those kinds of situations because they're a store. And so therefore the local authority can then issue an exemption in terms of they do not need to comply to XXX in terms of Regulations 5 and 6. In terms of the actual certificate, you often go into food premises and don't see a COA. And the regulation has always been clear, it must be displayed, except where it's difficult to do so. So we've ensured that that must be looked at, as well as with the vehicles that are related to the premises. We've now also have a new requirement, and again, this came from industry. Quite a few people approached us to say, you require the person in charge in Section 10 to ensure a few things, but you don't know if that person even knows what those things are and how then does he ensure it. So we've asked that we now have accredited training of the person in charge or the owner, depending on whose name is on the certificate of acceptability. This is to ensure that they can then make sure that the issues required in Section 10 are then complied with. We've also put in place document control, something that was not there at all, and that's purely because you need to have your system in place to know exactly where you got product from, what are you making, what was your batch number, all of those kinds of things. So it's kind of providing the base or the foundation for the next level, which is your HACCP system. We've also put in place recall. It was never there, purely because you've had silent recalls happening, you've had issues where things you're not even aware about, and so we've put them in place so that any manufacturer that does do a recall must then inform the local inspector as well as the National Directorate of Food Control, purely because this is a good control measure. And then we've also said traceability. You must have traceability system in place to understand where stuff came from. At the heart of what we do is the consumer. It's been said that the consumer is king, but sometimes the consumer doesn't know everything. And it's up to all of us to ensure that the consumer gets to know these things. The way in which we develop legislation and laws is that we create and we monitor, but we don't create in isolations. As I said to you, we've tried to ensure that when we develop or review this piece of legislation, we involve the food industry and we involve the academics. But over and above that, we rely on the academics to analyze, to give us the science, to look at things in terms of our situation in South Africa, because although we are looking to codex, our situation is different, and sometimes there might be things that we might need to be more stricter, and in terms of the World Trade Organization, we need to have the science for that. So we're hoping the academics help with that, and the food industry, as I've said, must implement the legislation. Then we have what we call the FLAG, the Food Legislation Advisory Group. I've had a lot of queries about this, so I thought I'd just bring this in. It's a non-statutory body that has been set up since 1996 to advise the Director of Food Control. And that in the main is about what's going on, what needs to be updated in terms of legislation. The membership has been by invitation, and it can't go to everybody. It's been to organizations and to academics, so universities, as well as the industry bodies. The members attend at their own cost and in their own time, and so they provide us with information, science, etc. We also have the consumer bodies on that as well, and we are supposed to be meeting twice a year, but for some time, for twice now, I've had to cancel meetings due to the listeriosis outbreak, and because we don't have new legislation to report on. And then we have the Joint Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Health Organization Codex Alimentarius Commission. It's an intergovernmental body established in 1962. So countries become members to this commission. And the objectives of the commission is that it's to protect consumer health and ensure fair practice in food trade. And if you think about our act, I said at the heart of it is to protect consumers. It coordinates all the international food standards work amongst various committees. It works through various horizontal or vertical committees. So there's quite a few. The one that deals with this piece of legislation is the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. So if anybody wants to reflect on where we've got a lot of what we've put into the regulation is from the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. And then there are various commodity committees, like for example, milk, fats and oils, and that's usually about the quality aspects of those products, but also sometimes about processing and what additives should be added for technological function for those commodities. Then you have regional committees that coordinate activities. So for Africa, we have a coordinating committee, and that tries to look at what are the specific issues on the continent and whether there's specific standards that are just need to be regionalized and not globally. As the Department of Health, we're the National Codex Contact Point. It's an arrangement that was put in place in 2004. And the point of Codex is that if we don't have it regulated, remember I said Article 2 says you must have in place ensuring that something is safe. If we don't have it in a regulation, Codex is your default. So if there's nothing, you always defer to Codex, and that's what we always do. So that in a nutshell, Linda, is the 638 and the changes that we've made to it. This is a slide about how to get to our regulations page, and you definitely need to know how to do this because it's a government web page and you need to follow these steps. You can't just click on food control in Google. It does not come up anymore. When I first started in 2006, it worked if you just went to Google, but now it doesn't because we've been integrated into the Department of Health's new web page. So that is for your attendees for this webinar. The last slide, Linda, is my contact details for any technical support or any queries in relation to the Act. It shouldn't necessarily always come to me, but there are two technical people. I know a lot of people know Mrs. Parin, and she's our microbiologist that has been at the center of updating this legislation and is the delegate to the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. So she's intimately involved in terms of what happens at that committee. And Mr. Tabete is our environmental health practitioner who provides the linkage between us and the municipalities in terms of being able to relate to the environmental health practitioners in terms of information, education and communication. So that in a nutshell, Linda, is what you've asked me to come and talk about today. I hope I've stuck to the time.
You have indeed, and we have quite a bit of time left for some questions. So I'm very happy about that. Thank you so much, Penny. Thank you for clarifying how we've gotten to this point, because I think for a lot of people, the timing of the promulgation of 638 was quite close to the listeriosis outbreak, and I think it was, a lot of people have assumed that it was as a result of that, but actually it has been coming for a while. Yes. I like the fact that you said the linkages to updates, for example, 5 keys. That's very crucial because we can't have mixed messages from that perspective. So I have a number of questions which hopefully Penny will be able to answer for us. You mentioned Port Health is now under the national control. How has this improved, do you think, in terms of the execution or the enforcement? How has this changed the enforcement of export and import requirements that are regulated by food control?
Okay, Port Health, if you understand the context of where it used to be at provincial level, and in some cases even at district level. So you wouldn't have consistency in application of legislation in different ports. You'd actually have port hopping by some of the importers. They wouldn't bring a consignment through Cape Town, they'd rather bring it through Durban because it was a bit more lenient. As an example, I'm not saying that's the truth, but that's an example. So with nationalization of it, it's not been brought to my unit, so I can't really comment on whether things have changed, but what has concretizes that we now have 3 directors responsible. So it's at a much higher level for decision-making purposes, as well as being managed at the national level, at the central level, which means that command and control and ensuring consistency of application is the aim. Whether it's actually happening, I cannot comment on that. So they have put in place standard operating procedures, which have been on draft for a long time. So those, I think, were published last year, and so all the ports of entry should be applying the same interpretation. But obviously, interpretation of law is different across people, and what we've tried to ensure is that we've trained port health officers, and they look by and large a lot at labeling. What I must just stress is that some people think that every food consignment goes through port health. That's not the case. No country in the world, I think, except the UAE maybe, because they do a lot of imports, looks at every consignment of food that comes through. The US has said they look at 10%. I don't know what our level is. Basically, our customs is in charge of food imports. So they will identify how often a certain consignment will go through. And they have a risk profiling procedure, although we have what we call a restricted and prohibitive goods list, where we've looked at the different HAS codes and identified which competent authority must check those consignments. But it doesn't mean that, let's say, for HAS code fish, they will always refer it to the Department of Health or to the Department of Agriculture. They will look at the history of the importer, and so that's why you would find on some shelves something that is not correctly labeled or something that's labeled in Chinese or whatever the case might be. The second thing is our customs system is based on honesty. So depending on where you've actually declared your goods to be, will it then go into the category. So some people can categorize it as just various goods, or they can categorize it as material, and then they'll have a different container. So it's very much an issue that sometimes things do go through overlooked. So that's the port health in a nutshell.
If something does go through and, you know, somebody out there identifies it, what would be the channel to report these things? Because I think obviously we would like to reduce the number of things that are slipping through that we're then being exposed to. Where should this be reported?
As I mentioned, when a product is offered for sale, so wherever that product has been offered for sale, you'd go to the local authority. And what we mean by the local authority, it's not where you pay your lights, but it's the bigger authority that looks after your fire services and your disaster processes. So if you're in Johannesburg, for example, that would be a metropolitan, so it will always be your lights place and that kind of thing. We only have 8 of those in the country, and the others are district municipalities. So you'd have to look for what is the name of your district municipality, and that's where you would report it. But you just need to phone and ask, where's your environmental health practitioner, or where's your municipal health services office, and that's where you would report any situation, whether it's labeling, whether you want something inspected properly or anything like that. If you don't get joy there, then you can refer it up to us, and then we can engage the relevant municipality or province.
Great. When it comes to Section 2 of the Foodstuffs Act, it's that really nice stretchy paragraph which says it's got to be safe regardless. Is the EHP the enforcer of that regulation, of that particular requirement of the Foodstuffs Act as well, or would there be another level of enforcement? Who would be enforcing the Act?
The enforcement of the Act is by the enforcer. The compliance is by the industry. So that Article 2, the first aspect is the industry that must comply, and then the enforcement is the actual EHV.
The workforce regulation, we're still hanging on to that one. Am I right?
Yes.
So although there are draft regulations currently under the Department of Agriculture for raw processed meat products, currently, if you sell boerewors or any sausage or anything, you still have to comply to the old boerewors regulations.
Yes. You cannot call a less than 90% meat a boerewors. You must then be called horse or whatever you want.
Because I know there's a bit of concern about the fact that the new regulations are not as strict as the current regulation, and how does that, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily good for us as consumers, the changes, but it's still in draft from that perspective. Okay. So just to clarify, in terms of the paragraph that refers to the previous certificates of acceptability, until the 22nd of June of this year, those were valid.
Yes.
Now they are no longer valid.
Yes.
If I do not have a 638 certificate. For all intents and purposes, I'm trading illegally.
Yes.
Okay. If we have to now go into some of the specifics. Okay, so when it comes to the definition of the food handler, so you've changed the definition of the food handler a little bit, because it's now someone who directly handles, but also comes into contact with packaged or unpackaged food contact surfaces and what have you. What about the waiter? What about the delivery guy? Do we mean they also need to be trained, and they also need to be, fall under the new regulations?
Absolutely, yes, Linda. The definition we've taken straight out of the Codex Hygiene, Code of Practice on Hygiene, and I think it's important. It's been said that your best advocate for your industry or your business is your employees. And if your employees know exactly what's going on in the environment, even if it's the typist or whatever, she's your best proponent of your business. I've heard people who work in a business and say, I'd never buy something from where I work, because they've seen or think they know what it should be. So it's always important to reduce that, I won't call it ignorance, but ensure that everybody knows about food safety. The principle being is we all eat food. And remember, consumers are part of this triage of ensuring that we have safe food. And so the more you educate, the more people will even prepare safe food at home. So therefore, even the cleaner, even the waiter, even the person who delivers the packaging stuff, because the packaging must also be free from dirt and whatever, as per the regulation. So it's also leading to what some people have termed the food safety culture. And of course, if your entire business doesn't know about what it's doing, what are you in the purpose of food making in the first place? So
I think based on the activity of the person, the training, because I think this links now to the requirement under Regulation 10 that the person in charge must ensure that the food handlers are level trained. Would it be reasonable to expect that the training would be based on the job function and based on the risk? So from a driver's perspective, there are certain things that person must know, they must conduct those activities, but they must know why they do those things. I think that links back to food safety, as with the waitress. So we wouldn't necessarily expect everyone to have had the same type of training, but it should be appropriate to their function.
Absolutely, appropriate to their function and appropriate to what it is they're doing. Like some people have even said, must the lady who rings up the goods at the till even be trained? And I said, yes, of course. Because that's the person who packs the chicken, the raw chicken, and she's going to package with my yogurt, and it's going to be cross-contaminated and those kinds of things. So if you're teaching them the basics like the 5 keys, then we are winning the war in terms of ensuring that we have a food safety culture.
And like you say, hopefully that's going home
yes.
at the end of the day, which is also what we're trying to achieve. When it comes to the requirements for the person in charge. So we've got lots of persons in charges running around out there that are either looking for training or they don't want to be the person in charge anymore. Because they now realize that they will have the criminal liability that's associated with an offence under regulation. So if we now look at the requirement, if this person if there's no proof of compliance with training, what you're really saying then is we couldn't issue a COA until that person has been deemed competent.
Well, that's the rationale behind why we set that deadline of 22nd of June, is purely because the training of the person in charge or the owner was only going to take effect a year later.
Yes.
And so therefore from that point in time, the COA should then be reissued. But we're not saying that because the person in charge is not trained, you cannot issue the COA. The COA is basically based on 5 and 6, but there should be compliance to all other aspects of the regulation to issue the COA. However, it's based on the inspector's perception of risk in relation to that. So depending on the operation, he could put through a restriction on the COA to say, I'm issuing you the COA, but you have 2 months or 3 months, or whatever time he thinks is workable, in which the owner or the person in charge should get the training. We're basically trying to ensure that nobody puts out unsafe food. Sometimes people might not have the necessary accredited training, but the inspector himself can do on-the-job training if he picks up a hazard as well. And that's why we said in there it's accredited service provider or inspector, because sometimes in an inspection you might pick up a hazard and say, or a risk, and say, this is not acceptable, I need to just teach you about this and why it is. And so that's on the job training as well. So we're not saying that the COA cannot be issued because they're not trained, but we try to link it together, and then the EHP looks at it as that in terms of his discretion. And that's why I always say you cannot have anybody just inspecting or enforcing these regulations. We need a 4-year or 3-year qualified person who can make that professional judgment in terms of the risk and the hazard. And I know some people have had concerns about that because my professional judgment and somebody else's professional judgment is different, but there can be an arbitration, and that's what law is about. There needs an arbitrator to come in.
Yeah, because, you know, strictly speaking, you could have 52 different opinions about a particular paragraph, and I think that can cause a lot of confusion. And I think what you're saying is if we need arbitration in an organization which may have outlets in a number of different provinces where we've got a number of different district municipalities, then that's what we should do. We should rather try and get, you know, some consensus across an organisation where they have multiple outlets.
And that's what has come up, and I want to stress that to the industry. If you find that you have inconsistent application across or within a municipality, advise us and we will try to intervene. We have done that in the past. The second thing just to mention is, as part of the Listeriosis outbreak, we were wanting to do a training of all the EHPs, as well as try to institutionalize it in the universities. However, we could not get that going from the bid process. So we've in the process of finalizing that, and we will look at now rolling out the training. However, some municipalities have said, we've already implemented, we are actually the service providers doing the training in terms of Section 10. So we like, you know, this is quite late. Unfortunately, that's the way of government in terms of supply chain.
I think it's probably still a good idea to get everybody on a similar page, you know, at least, because, and training would probably assist, because we've had a number of queries also from, you know, from EHPs. If I had to take the sort of EHP, is there a mandate for how often they visit food facilities, you know, or is it up to them to decide?
Okay, what the Directorate Environmental Health has put in place, and they've published them, is what we call norms and standards for environmental health. And within that framework, they have a section called health surveillance of premises, and food premises then fall under that. In that document, it says the municipalities must look at a risk-based approach in terms of prioritizing how often they inspect. And that's also the premise that we come from, and that's also the premise internationally, because you're not going to visit everybody once a month just for the sake of a piece of paper. However, that being said, they did put in place further in the document that any premises, irrespective of what it is, must be visited 4 times a year, which implies that it then means once per quarter. However, the municipalities still do a risk rating of their premises, and then on that basis decide how often they're going to visit premises. If an industry is not being visited, let us know, and then we can alert our Directorate Environmental Health.
I think you might have a few that are feeling like they're, you know, a special case because they might be getting very regular. But sometimes if you just have to give it, more attention until you get with the program, that's also not appropriate. All right, so we've got a question here which is definitely coming from the processed meat industry, because now they're being bombarded, obviously, with a number of legal instruments as a result of the listeriosis outbreak. We've now got the NRCS that has the mandate to inspect against SANS 885. How do you envisage the two ministries coming together at a facility? I think you've already stated that the provision is that a processed meat facility would have to have a valid COA, regardless of the fact that it will now be inspected by the NRCS. What about technical requirements? So if SANS 885 and the VC 9100 now has more technical or specific requirements about walls and floors, would that legal instrument now take precedence over the basic requirements of Regulation 638?
Well, that's the premise from which we've been working on in the fish industry. Because remember that one slide that showed the fragmented system, and I said they handled fish and they handled canned meat greater than 10%. Those facilities currently still need a 638, or at that stage 962 or 918, but now 638. And then the VC builds on that, and it incorporates certain things from SANS 0049 as well. But that was purely because an arrangement was made between the department and the NRCS that they would be responsible for the fish industry. And it's regulated in that 1930 regulations. It actually refers to it. What happened with the current VC is that the industry had started on SANS 885 a number of years ago, and I don't think they wanted to see that work going down the drain. Immediately after the announcement of the listeriosis challenge, we engaged the industry and said, now you've got to have a HACCP system in place because a food safety incident has happened, and that is automatically requires a HACCP system in place. So you actually have the process industry being regulated 3 times. 1, a 638, 2, a HACCP, and 3, the VC. And initially the VC was not going to happen. And the industry then said, yes, they still want it. So I said, so how do you see this working? And it was explained to me by the current CEO's predecessor, but he wasn't the CEO at that stage, but the head of SAMPA, is that HACCP will look at the food safety management system. The VC is going to look at the micro requirements. So although you have a preventative system in relation to HACCP, which doesn't rely on in-product testing, they still want somebody to come in and look at their product and look at the micro, as well as what originally the intention or the purpose of SANS 885 was to look at their compositional and quality, because that was their concern, is that anybody was calling anything a polony and it could have varying amounts of meat or varying amounts of soya. So they were trying to level the playing field in terms of that. And now what has come out of that is that it also looked at food safety aspects, and they're comfortable with that, according to SAMPA in 2018, that the VC now is to assist them with the micro monitoring.
Okay, all right, so I think it's going to be, there more than likely going to be a few grey areas in that particular area specifically, or that, around these multiple pieces of legislation, but we'll have to deal with one issue at a time. I think the intention is clear. Right, the last question I have for you, Penny, goes a little bit in more detail regarding the accredited training aspect, because I think there's a bit of confusion there too. There is no definition within the regulation for what is accredited. It was there previously. There is a definition within 961, the milking shed regulation, but we don't have a definition for accredited. So when you put this into the regulation, what was your intention? What were you trying to achieve by requiring the person in charge to have accredited training?
Okay, Linda, the critical thing we wanted to ensure that the food safety training that they underwent was credible. We didn't want anyone Joe Soap opening a company and saying he's providing food safety training. So we wanted to ensure that it was accredited through that process. In 961, it's specific for milking sheds and the dairy sector. So anyone dealing with raw milk. So you're going to have, you might have a CETA that specifically deals with that sector. And so therefore we could put in place the definition we put in 961. The challenge we had when we put the definition in 364 was that there's different CETAs, there's different processes around that, how they work, and there's different levels of operation of businesses that we have that are covered by 968. So you could have somebody sitting in the theatre, if they still call that, or you could have somebody sitting in the retail sector. And then we said we want to ensure that it's just SAQA aligned, because the other issue that came up is that sometimes you have the person in charge who could be the QC person who has a degree in food science or food safety or a master's or even a PhD in that. And so on that basis, we had to be a bit more open about it and be more lenient in terms of not trying to encapsulate it into a definition, and just try to say it must be SAQA linked is what we try to define it as. Some CETAs were talking about learnerships, and we said, but you can't put an owner through a learnership. This is not the intention of this. Later on, when we want to regulate the handlers, maybe there will be a need for learnership. The second thing that we linked to SAQA is because the government is promoting skills and upskilling of people. And that's why we're trying to say, rather have accredited training so that you're upskilling people in relation to be able to be mobile and move from place to place. In some instances, you have people who have learned on the job. They can speak food safety in their sleep. But if they want to transfer to another organization, they can't, because they don't have a qualification in their repertoire, in their CV, whereas they know exactly what they're doing. So on that basis was the rationale behind why we said accredited and not just any training, because anybody could just open up a company and say they're now going to teach food safety.
I think what's also important about the SAQA process is that it allows for recognition of prior learning. So that would mean that a person in charge would not necessarily have to go through a training course, but they could actually write the test, so to speak. And if they pass the test based on their previous knowledge, inherent knowledge,
Yes.
that portfolio of evidence would be sufficient.
Yes.
They wouldn't necessarily have to actually be trained. And I think it's important that the training providers remember that,
yes,
and also put that option on the table, because that's part of part of that process. Yeah, I think there's there are a lot of providers out there that are offering really good training, and there are some that are accredited, there are some that are not accredited. I think it also depends very much based on what the current level of the person is, and I think that's why it's important that that person has to actually confirm, or it's a personal responsibility that they are actually suitably qualified,
yes,
based on based on where they're at. I think it opens the discussion for a number of other opportunities for types of accreditation similar to what they have in the UK or the US, where it's not necessarily only a SAQA process, but you've got the likes of the Royal Institute of Public Health, for example, which is put in place a syllabus, if you like, for a similar kind of process. And I'm assuming that that would be also considered credible, because there's a syllabus against which you are ensuring that people are appropriately trained.
Yeah, I think at a later stage, because I think that people were also thinking the accredited training that they would receive as a professional would also suffice. And I think that's not what our intention was. At this point in time, we're only linking it to the SAQA process.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I think that's clear. I think in terms of, the way forward, looking at the appropriate providers and the appropriate providers that are looking at SAQA accreditation or CETA accreditation. I think also we haven't got time to discuss it, but the level of training I think is quite important, because we can have SAQA accredited training, but it's at a level 1 or a level 2, which is very appropriate for a food handler. But I don't think that was your intention for a person in charge, because that person has to have a management understanding of the activities.
Depending on where you are.
Of course.
Like a street food vendor probably is going to do an NQF 1, 2 or 3.
Yes.
So yeah, it would just depend. And that's the challenge of having a regulation that is supposed to cover such a broad range of the industry, that it was very difficult to hone in on. Even with that, there are certain types of food business managers that are not necessarily just an entire company. The person is the owner, the person is the waiter, the person is the one who makes the food and buys the food and all that. So he's a one-man show, and so therefore it's very difficult to have trust. And in those scenarios, we've also said that's where the inspectors could come in as well, because they are supposed to be having a street food program or a caterer program, or any of these individuals, the home industries as well, these individuals that have their own single-man business, bed and breakfast. All of those kinds of situations only have a sole owner and a sole preparer and a sole waiter. So in those circumstances, the NQF1 might also be applicable. So that's why it was very difficult for us to do that.
I appreciate that. Right, well, thank you so much, Penny. It is 12 o'clock and we have, yeah, it's been jam-packed full of information. So I hope you were listening carefully, because I think most of the questions that I've been hearing out there have definitely been answered. If you have any more questions and you'd like to pop those through to us on email, you're more than welcome to do so, so that we can make sure that we get the right information out there into the market to try and clarify the regulations, so that we can all do what we're supposed to be doing. And I think that was complying. Penny, thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it. Everybody out there, thank you for being with us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to chatting to you next time.